Have you ever imagined a man who chose to live cut off from the world, only to wake one misty morning and see a small figure crouched in the snow, silent, ghost-like, as if it didn't belong to this earth? It wasn't the shape of an animal, nor the stance of a poacher. It stirred a chill deeper than the winter air. And when he moved closer, he realized the truth. It was a child, an Apache girl, thin as kindling, trembling like a brittle twig about to snap. Before we dive deeper into this strange turn of fate, don't forget to like this video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Every bit of support keeps these Western stories alive. Stories where life and death, trust and suspicion are separated by nothing more than a thin, fragile line. And I promise you this, if you stay until the end, you'll see how loneliness can transform into something no one expected. That year, winter on Timber Hollow was colder than any man cared to remember. Ethan Marlowe, a former soldier who'd seen more death than daylight, had buried himself in these ridges to escape society. He'd lost nearly everything: family, faith, and even the peace of dreamless sleep. Night after night, he lay in his small cabin, listening to the wind scrape across the roof, his heart pounding under the weight of old battles. The town down in the valley only meant questions, stares, and pity. So Ethan chose solitude, and solitude, after 5 years, had carved him hollow. That morning was no different from the rest. He split logs, mended fences, did what he could to keep his hands busy and his mind quiet. The ground was frozen stiff under his boots. His left knee ached with every move, the scar of his last fight. He didn't complain. There was no one to hear it anyway. His life had become a chamber of silence, until something moved at the tree line. At first, he thought it might be a deer hiding in the brush, but it didn't shift like an animal. It sat still, too still. As he drew closer, crunching over frost, he saw it was a person, a child. The girl couldn't have been more than 7 or 8. Her clothes were rags, her bare feet raw and purple with cold. Her hair was tangled with dirt, her face streaked, her lips cracked. Yet what struck Ethan most wasn't her hunger or her weakness. It was her eyes, wide open, staring at nothing, emptied of fear, emptied of hope. She didn't cry, she didn't flinch. She just sat there, hollow, as if she had already given up on the world. In that instant, Ethan Marlowe, the man who had sworn to keep everyone out, was forced to face a question. Do you step forward, or turn away? Suspicion pricked at him. Who abandons a child here? Could this be a trap? Were there men waiting in the woods for him to lower his guard? Years of living alone had taught him that kindness usually came with a cost, and he had paid too many costs already. But as the cold wind rattled through the trees, and as he looked at the fragile frame before him, his hand moved before his mind caught up. He shrugged off his heavy coat and draped it across her shoulders. The fabric swallowed her small body, and somehow the warmth seeped back into his own skin, as if he was the one being saved. When he lifted her, she weighed almost nothing. A child should carry the weight of life. This one felt like an echo of it. Ethan carried her back across the field, through the door of his cabin. A place that had known only the sound of firewood popping, now held the shallow breaths of a stranger. He stoked the fire, heated water, and coaxed it between her lips. She drank in desperate sips, as if the cup might vanish. He broke apart last night's cornbread, dipped it in beans, and set it in her hands. She ate fast, both hands clutching food, silent but ravenous. Ethan sat across the room, arms folded, eyes never leaving her. Suspicion gnawed at him. Where had she come from? Who had left her? Why hadn't she spoken a word? He searched her face for answers, but all he found was exhaustion. That night, he did not sleep. He sat by the hearth, feeding the fire so the flames would never die. watching the fragile rise and fall of her ribs. The cabin, which for years had echoed with nothing but loneliness, now pulsed with something strange fear. Yes, but also the faintest thread of hope. Ethan Marlowe could not know it yet. But the moment he carried that girl across his threshold, his life had shifted onto a road he could never turn back from. A road where loneliness would test him once more, but might finally lead him to something he thought had died long ago, a family. 2 days passed, and Timber Hollow lay buried in a biting cold. Inside the small log cabin, little Taya slept by the fire, her breathing steadier now, her cheeks carrying the faintest trace of color. Ethan Marlowe, however, did not rest. The image of the girl crouched at the tree line still haunted him, and the same question gnawed at his mind. Who could abandon a child like that? And why on the 3rd morning? As Ethan worked on a barn hinge, his dog gave a short bark and then went silent. He looked up. On the ridge trail, a lone figure appeared, at first. Just a dark speck in the fog, then slowly, the shape of a woman. She moved with effort, one hand braced against her hip as if in pain. Her deerskin dress was torn, streaked with dust, her long black hair hung heavy, each step weighed down by exhaustion. Ethan froze. Old soldier's instinct surged in him, heartbeat quickening, hand sliding close to the revolver on his belt. A stranger on this ridge where strangers never came could only mean trouble. He stood still, watching, every sense sharpened. The woman stopped just a few yards away. Her breathing was ragged, her eyes dark, deep, and tired but not broken. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, hoarse, each word deliberate. "I look for child." Just 5 words, yet they struck Ethan like a blow. His hand left the revolver. He understood at once. The girl in his cabin. Her daughter. He gave a single nod, then stepped aside. The woman moved past him without a word of thanks, without hesitation, only determination and weariness. By the hearth. Taya stirred. When she saw the woman, her voice cracked, barely more than a whisper. "Mama." In that instant, the walls Ethan had built around his heart trembled. The woman dropped to her knees, cradled her daughter, burying her face in the child's tangled hair, kissing her forehead. To others it might have been an ordinary reunion. But to Ethan, who had lost both a wife and an unborn child, it was like watching a memory he had long buried come alive before his eyes. He stood in the doorway, feeling like an intruder on sacred ground. At last, the woman lifted her head. Her eyes were rimmed red, but dry. She spoke slowly, her English thick with Apache cadence. "My name is Nayeli." The name carried through the cabin like a foreign song. Ethan gave a short nod. "Ethan." Nayeli said nothing more. She still held her child tightly. Then, unexpectedly, her voice came again low, firm. "Broken in rhythm but not in weight, I follow, old way. You feed my daughter. My child live, so I belong to you." Ethan was struck silent. He had not expected this. A stranger, ragged and worn, stood before him and claimed such words. His chest tightened with surprise, and then with hesitation. He had no faith in traditions. The war had taught him bitter lessons that honor. Oaths, rituals all could shatter in a single gunshot. He had promised himself never again to carry another burden, never again to bind himself to anyone. Yet the way Nayeli spoke calm, not pleading, not begging, made it impossible to dismiss. Ethan's gaze dropped to her hands, rough and thin, the bruises fresh along her arms. Her ribs showed beneath the torn seams of her dress. She had come through hardship, things she wasn't ready to name. He wasn't ready either, but he did the only thing he could. In that moment he stepped back and pulled the door wider. Nayeli understood. She rose slowly, lifting Taya in her arms, and walked fully inside. The door closed behind them with a quiet click, but to Ethan, the sound rolled like thunder. Something had changed. That night, the cabin was no longer the same. Ethan sat at the table, fingers tight around a tin cup, listening to the soft breaths of mother and child as they lay near the fire. The familiar silence of loneliness was broken, replaced with something harder to name. Responsibility burden. Or perhaps a faint spark of warmth fighting through the ice of his chest. He could not tell. Ethan Marlowe, the man who believed his life's doors had been shut for good, now found himself face to face with a new reality, an Apache woman bound by tradition, and a fragile little girl who had already taken root inside his home. They had entered without asking permission, without negotiation, and the only choice he could make, in that moment, was to let them stay. He didn't know if it was the beginning of a home or the start of a tragedy. All he knew was this from that night on. The cabin on Timber Hollow would never again belong to him alone. And that, more than anything, was the greatest surprise of all. By the fourth day since Nayeli and Taya had stepped across his threshold, Timber Hollow no longer sounded the same. The little log cabin, once wrapped in silence, now carried new notes, the soft breathing of a child, the quiet clatter of an Apache woman arranging worn tools, the faint murmur that might have been a prayer or perhaps a lullaby, broken and scattered by the wind. Ethan Marlowe took it all in with a discomfort he couldn't quite hide. For 5 years he'd lived in absolute quiet. Now, even the scrape of a chair leg or the sound of another breath unsettled him. Every time he caught Nayeli's eyes, he turned away, awkward as a boy instead of a veteran who had survived battlefields. Nayeli, for her part, said little. She kept Taya close, her gaze steady but guarded. Inside Ethan, a private struggle played out. He wanted to help them, but feared the weight of their presence. He wanted to speak, but each time words reached his lips, unease pushed them back down. Still, action spoke for him. When he noticed Taya shivering in her ragged coat, bare feet pressed close to the hearth, he knew he had to do something he had avoided for nearly a year, ride into town. That decision was no small matter. Ethan hated the town, the stares, the whispers, the sense of being measured and found wanting. But he could not ignore the plain needs of the woman and child now under his roof. That morning, the sky was the color of lead. Ethan saddled his horse in silence, stuffing his worn leather bag with coins. On the porch, Nayeli stood with Taya wrapped in her arms. She didn't ask where he was going, didn't try to stop him. Her eyes alone spoke half cautious, half challenging. "Will you come back?" Ethan gave no answer in words. He only nodded once and rode down the frost-crusted slope into the valley fog. The town was just as he remembered. The crooked sign above the general store, the saloon stinking of whiskey and smoke, and always the eyes curious, suspicious tracking him as soon as he dismounted. Ethan pulled his hat lower and pushed through the store's door. "Didn't expect to see you before snow sets in," said Thad Warren, the shopkeeper, lifting his brows with a mix of surprise and suspicion. Ethan didn't bother with small talk. He recited a list: dried beans, salt, a spool of strong thread, a few yards of coarse fabric, and the smallest pair of boots Thad had. Each request made the man's eyes narrow further, as if piecing together a puzzle. But Ethan offered no explanation. He set down his coins, collected the bundles, and left as quietly as he had entered. On the ride home, the wind cut across his back, sharp as a whip. But the true discomfort came from inside the unease of imagining Nayeli's face when he laid those things down. He feared the moment her lips might tremble, unsure whether to thank him or remain wary. By the time he reached the cabin, evening had dimmed the ridge. He pushed open the door, the warmth of smoke and fire rushing out to meet him. Nayeli knelt by the hearth, stirring a pot with steady hands. Taya sat cross-legged on the fur rug, her dark eyes wide as Ethan stepped in. He set the bundle on the floor and nudged it toward them. Taya tugged at the flap, and when she uncovered the small coat and soft fur-lined boots, she let out a sound so faint Ethan thought it was the wind through the logs. Nayeli took the coat in her hands. Her fingers trembled just slightly. She looked at Ethan, her gaze softer now but still careful. Her voice was low, roughened by fatigue. "You thought not only of food." Ethan's throat tightened. He gave a stiff nod, busying himself with his gloves, avoiding her eyes. He didn't know what to say. Inside, awkwardness tangled with something else, something like relief. That night, as Taya slept curled in the new coat, her boots neatly set by the fire, the cabin carried a silence of a different kind. Not the heavy silence of loneliness, but a quieter space, uncertain, cautious, yet seeded with the first stirrings of trust. Ethan sat at the table, his shadow stretching long in the firelight. Across the room, Nayeli sewed along the torn seam of her dress with the new thread, her hand steady. They said nothing to one another, but each stitch she pulled, each time he glanced and then looked away, spoke louder than words. The thread wasn't just mending fabric, it was stitching something fragile between them, not yet belonging, not yet safe, but enough to make three souls feel a little less adrift on the cold winter ridge of Timber Hollow. Day by day, the little cabin on Timber Hollow began to find a new rhythm. For Ethan, it was both unfamiliar and strangely comforting. After years of living with nothing but the sound of wind for company, he now woke each morning to softer noises, Nayeli's light steps by the stove, the faint laugh of Taya playing with a piece of wood, the quiet warmth of two other souls sharing his roof. Ethan started showing Nayeli the chores he had always carried alone. He led her to the grain shed behind the barn, pointing out how to lift the wooden latch, how to check the sacks for damp or mold. At first, she only watched with guarded eyes, keeping Taya pressed close to her side. But slowly she began to try lifting the latch herself, hefting a sack across her shoulder. The movements weren't graceful yet, but each effort spoke of determination. And Ethan realized, with some surprise, that he felt steadier having another pair of hands share the work. Taya was different. She rarely spoke, but her dark eyes followed his every move. One afternoon, while he stacked boards on the porch, she tugged at his sleeve. Her voice was so soft it almost vanished into the wind. "Ian." Ethan froze, his chest tightening with a sudden gentleness. She hadn't called him by his full name, nor with the distant Mr. the townsfolk used. Just Ian, simple, clumsy, yet full of trust. A fragile piece clicked into place inside his heart, where emptiness had long lived. He placed a rough hand on her tangled hair. "That's right. I'm here. From then on." The name stuck. That small syllable, spoken in her quiet voice, echoed through the cabin and became its own bond. When night fell, Timber Hollow's wind howled sharp through the cracks of the logs. Before, Ethan had always faced the darkness alone, lying stiff on his wooden bed, arm across his forehead, listening to his heart pound in the silence. But now, everything was different. That first night after his trip to town, he laid an extra blanket near the hearth for Nayeli and Taya. They exchanged no long words, only a quiet glance of acknowledgement. When Taya slipped into sleep, her tiny hand clutching her mother's sleeve, Nayeli pulled the blanket tighter around her daughter, then looked across the fire at Ethan. The flames flickered in her eyes. No speech passed between them, only a slow nod. It was enough. For this night, there would be peace. Ethan lay back on his own blanket, not far from them. The warmth of the fire mingled with the steady breaths of child and mother. For the first time in years, he slept without flinching at the ghosts of battle. The next morning, he woke to something he hadn't felt in a long while, not emptiness, but presence. Taya was curled in her new coat, breath misting faint in the chill air. Nayeli stretched by the stove, coaxing the fire to life again. A new rhythm of living together had begun rough. Simple, but alive. In the days that followed, care showed itself in small, quiet ways. Ethan no longer prepared meals only for himself. He added an extra scoop of beans, saved the best cuts of smoked pork for Taya. When he noticed Nayeli's hands raw and red from the cold, he placed his old leather gloves in them without a word. She didn't say thank you, but the guarded sharpness in her eyes softened. Nayeli, in turn, showed her thoughtfulness without speaking. When she patched her dress, she stitched an extra length of thread into the seam of his coat. She rearranged the cluttered shelves, hung tools neatly, mended a frayed strap without being asked. Every gesture was practical, but each one carried quiet care. And every night, while the wind clawed at the ridges, 3 strangers lay close by one fire. For Ethan, it was a transformation almost too large to grasp. His cabin, once a hollow shell filled only with cold, and silence now carried warmth, the soft weight of companionship, and a peace he had thought he would never know again. Winter on Timber Hollow stretched on, the winds biting and the snow piling high over the cabin roof. 3 people who had once been strangers now moved in a rhythm together, Nayeli stoking the fire each morning, Taya sketching little shapes on a charred piece of wood, and Ethan splitting logs or checking the feed troughs for the horses. The tasks were small, but tied together, they formed a pattern of living that felt almost gentle, something he had never dared to imagine for himself. One evening, with the wind outside howling like a bugle on the battlefield, Ethan sat quietly repairing an old bridle strap. His rough hands moved slow, the leather stiff under his fingers. Then another hand reached across the thin, steady hand of Nayeli. Without a word, she took the strap from him and set the needle through the leather. The firelight glowed against her high cheekbones, her eyes sharp with focus. Ethan watched in silence, a warmth stirring in his chest that was more than gratitude. For the first time in years, he felt he was not carrying the weight alone. That night, after Taya had fallen asleep, Ethan spoke softly. "I don't want you staying here because of some tradition." Nayeli lifted her head, her dark eyes gleaming in the fire's glow. Her voice was low but steady. "I know. I don't stay for tradition. I stay for you, because you look at me, not as something owned, but with respect." The words struck deep, like heat seeping into long frozen wood. Ethan had grown used to being seen as nothing more than a broken soldier, a recluse hiding from the world. Nayeli, though, saw past the scars and solitude. She saw the man still standing. From that moment, the air in the cabin shifted. Suspicion faded, replaced by quiet connection. Sometimes Nayeli would smile faintly when Taya called him Ian, Ethan, instead of looking away. Began to meet her eyes across the table, or while they worked side by side. In those glances lay something shared pain endured, but also trust being born. One snowy afternoon, the 3 of them sat near the hearth. Taya had dozed off in her mother's lap. Nayeli smoothed the girl's hair, then looked up at Ethan. Her voice was soft, almost cautious. "You had a wife. I see her still in your eyes." Ethan froze. He rarely spoke of the past, never of the woman he had buried with all his hopes. But Nayeli's eyes held no accusation, no jealousy, only the weight of understanding. After a long pause, he nodded. "Yes, she's gone. And the child she carried, gone with her." Silence followed, but it wasn't heavy. It was the kind of silence that held room for both grief and solace. Nayeli placed her hand gently over her chest. "I lost family too. I know what that feels like. The pain never leaves, but it can be shared." Ethan looked at her, and in her eyes he saw not pity, but kinship. A woman who had endured loss, yet carried herself with dignity. And in that moment, he realized her presence, her and Taya's, wasn't just filling the hollow spaces of his cabin. It was stitching together the fractures in his heart. That night, the three lay close beneath heavy blankets, Taya curled in her mother's arms, clutching her ragged doll. Ethan lay on the other side, Nayeli between them. In the dark, her shoulder brushed against his arm. Neither moved away. The touch was slight, but it carried more comfort than words. They needed no promises, just warmth, just the assurance of another body nearby. From then on, the cabin on Timber Hollow ceased to be only a refuge against storm and cold. It was slowly becoming a home of connection. Each of Nayeli's small acts, each quiet gesture from Ethan, each innocent call of Ian from Taya, they wove together into a bond that grew stronger by the day. And all three of them knew, though no one said it aloud, that bond wasn't forged by custom or obligation, but by choice. A quiet, deliberate choice. The kind of choice that could turn years of loneliness into something whole again, into love, real and lasting. One gray afternoon, as the winds of Timber Hollow moaned through the ridges, Ethan came in from splitting wood. He found Nayeli sitting at the rough-hewn table, her hands clasped tight, her eyes distant. Taya was near the hearth, scratching playful shapes onto a charred stick of wood, blissfully unaware that the world outside could be cruel. Ethan sensed something different right away. He set down the bundle of logs and sat across from her. He didn't ask, just gave a small nod, as if to say, "Go on." Nayeli looked at him for a long moment, then exhaled, the sound heavy like stones sliding from her chest. "I must tell you. So you know the truth." Her voice was low, even, but her eyes carried a weight of pain pressed down for too long. Ethan waited, silent. "We weren't just wandering," she said, pausing as her fingers tightened. "We were running. From a trading post, a place that sold people." Ethan went still. The words cut through the cabin like a cold knife. In a heartbeat, the bruises on her arms, the hollow look in Taya's eyes that first night they all pieced together into one grim picture. Nayeli went on, her tone trembling yet firm. It was a small post, not on any map. The men there lived outside the law. They traded furs, whiskey, and human lives. I worked one season, thinking if I stayed quiet, we'd be safe. But the man who ran it learned Taya was mine. Apache born. He said she would fetch a high price. I couldn't let that happen. I fought back, cut one of them, and we ran into the snow. The storm slowed them, but I don't know if they'll stop. The room fell into silence. Only the crack of the firewood filled the air, along with Nayeli's uneven breath. Taya kept drawing her childish marks, innocent, untouched by the gravity in her mother's confession. Ethan bowed his head, hands locked together. Rage rose in him not at Nayeli, never at her but at the world outside. The world that treated women and children as nothing more than goods on a ledger. He lifted his eyes, his voice firm. "You need to know this. None of that is your fault. And if they come, they'll have to come through me first." Nayeli's eyes glistened, though no tears fell. Her shoulders trembled, then eased, as though for the first time since fleeing, she allowed herself to believe in safety. That night, Ethan laid his Henry rifle across the table and began breaking it down, piece by piece. He cleaned the barrel, oiled the lever, checked every screw. Each motion was a vow. Nayeli sat nearby, silent, only watching. In her gaze was worry. Yes, but also a fragile relief. At last, there was someone who would stand in the doorway for her. Together they drew a plan. If men came, Nayeli and Taya would slip out through the barn and down to the creek. Ethan would hold the front door. The thought alone thickened the air in the cabin. But with it came something else, a fierce sense of unity. Two people, scarred by loss, now tied together by a promise to protect what little they had left. The days that followed carried a quiet vigilance. Each morning, Ethan scanned the tree line for tracks. Nayeli kept a small bundle ready with bread and herbs in case they had to run. And yet, within that tension, their bond only grew stronger. One evening, while Taya slept, Ethan sat on the porch with the rifle propped beside his boot. Nayeli stepped out, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. She stood next to him, silent. After a while, her voice drifted low. "I know. I brought danger to your home." Ethan kept his eyes on the dark timber. "This home isn't just mine anymore. It's ours. All three of us. And I don't regret it." Nayeli turned toward him. In her eyes, gratitude and trust burned brighter than the fear. Her lips moved, shaping only two words. "Thank you." In that moment, the threat still hung over them. But something deeper anchored them together. Not the absence of danger, but the presence of someone to share it with. And for Ethan, that shared weight, though heavy as the mountain itself, was warm as the fire that burned through the long nights of Timber Hollow. Winter slowly withdrew from Timber Hollow. Snow melted into thin streams that wound down the slopes, carrying the first signs of spring. The cabin was no longer a shelter of chance. For Ethan, it had become a true home, a place where every morning he woke to the sound of Nayeli preparing breakfast and Taya's bright little voice calling him Ian. Yet within that peace, the old wounds of the past found ways to rise again. One evening, after Taya had gone to sleep, Nayeli sat at the table, her eyes fixed on the fire. Ethan sat across from her, sharpening his hunting knife. The room was quiet, but something lingered between them, unsaid. At last, Nayeli placed her hand flat on the table, her voice low but steady. "You once loved someone. I know her name is still in your heart." Ethan's hand stopped. He drew a long breath, his eyes shadowed with sorrow but unflinching. "Sarah. She died carrying our child. I thought I had nothing left worth keeping." Nayeli didn't bristle, didn't reproach. She only nodded, her gaze full of understanding. "I don't want to replace her. I only want to walk beside you, with my daughter, and maybe with another child." Ethan fell silent. For years, he had never let himself imagine such a thing. Yet the way Nayeli spoke without pleading, without hesitation, only firm resolve was like wind through the pines, steady and undeniable. He met her eyes. "If that's what you want, then we'll face it together." Weeks later, Nayeli began to notice the signs. She placed her hand against her belly, her eyes lit with both fear and joy. Ethan saw it, and without asking, laid his own hand over hers. They said nothing, but both knew a new beginning had already taken root. As that truth grew, Ethan realized he could no longer keep his family hidden in a cabin deep in the timber. He wanted Nayeli and Taya to be seen, acknowledged not as shadows, but as kin. There was only one way to make that certain: go into town and put their names in the county book. The morning they left, they prepared carefully. Nayeli wore a blue cotton dress Ethan had traded for from a traveling merchant, her long hair braided neat and shining. Taya rode before him on the saddle, clutching his coat, her face bright with excitement. Ethan wore his wool coat, his jaw firm, his eyes lit with resolve. When their horse stopped before the clerk's office, the stares began at once. A white man, tall and grim, walking hand in hand with an Apache woman whose belly now showed. The glances, the whispers, the quiet shakes of the head, Ethan felt them all. But he didn't waver. He gripped Nayeli's hand tighter and walked her straight inside. The room smelled of ink and old paper. There were no flowers, no music, no ceremony, only a county ledger, a pen, and the sound of their names written side by side. When they finished, they looked at one another, and that was enough. Stepping back into the street, Ethan did not let go of her hand. He held it openly, for every eye to see, and no one dared speak a word. On the ride home, Taya giggled, resting her head against his chest. Nayeli leaned gently into his shoulder and whispered, "Now we are one. Not because we had to be, but because we chose to be." Ethan nodded, his eyes fixed on the snow-tipped ridges in the distance. Inside him rose a strength he had not felt in years, not just the will to defend, but to build, to hold fast. He knew there would be whispers yet, dangers still waiting, but he also knew that with their hearts united, there was nothing they could not endure. The cabin on Timber Hollow was no longer just a refuge against the storm. It had become the home of a real family, a family born out of loss, but built on sharing, and carried forward by a quiet, unshakable determination. Spring finally painted Timber Hollow green. Meltwater trickled down the slopes, sparrows chattered on the cabin roof, and the scent of pine resin drifted through the open door. In that season of renewal, Ethan Marlowe, for the first time in many years, felt life lift from his shoulders. He had a home now, not only for himself, but for Nayeli, for Taya, and for the child soon to be born. Day by day, Ethan threw himself into work, not merely to survive, but to build. He hauled pine boards from the ridge, shaved them smooth, and fitted them together into a cradle. Every swing of the hammer, every groove of the chisel carried a tenderness for the son he had not yet met. Hands once trained to pull a trigger now shaped something meant to hold life, not end it. In the hollow ring of wood on wood, Ethan found peace. Taya, too, discovered something new, a place of her own. Ethan built a little loft above the stove, lined with an old fur rug, and hung up the rag doll Nayeli had stitched. The first night she climbed up, hugging the doll close, her eyes shone brighter than any fire. She leaned over the railing and whispered Ian with a trust so pure it nearly broke him. For Ethan, that word warmed him more than any blaze he had ever tended. Then came the day that changed everything. In the first winds of summer, when Timber Hollow smelled of pine sap and running water, Nayeli gave birth to a strong, healthy boy. The child's first cry rang through the cabin rafters like a declaration life begins again. Ethan named him Jonas, after his own father who had once taught him the dignity of honest work. Holding the boy in his arms, his shoulders trembled. Tears ran freely, not of sorrow, but of gratitude. In that moment, Ethan understood the cabin that had once been a refuge of despair had become the hearth of his heart. No longer was it filled with silence and ghosts, it now pulsed with a baby's cry, a child's laughter, a woman's hand steady at his side. The months that followed were hard, but meaningful. Ethan rose with the dawn, tending both the horses and the cradle. Taya doted on her new brother, inventing little games that sent Jonas squealing with delight. Nayeli, though weary from childbirth, remained strong and graceful cooking, sewing, humming soft songs in Apache that wove through the walls like blessings. 4 people, once scattered by loss, now circled one another like a flame that would not go out. And friends, if you've stayed with this story to this point, you've seen something remarkable. From a broken soldier who thought his life was over, Ethan Marlowe has found not only survival but a reason to live, to love, and to build. From a cold, lonely cabin in the timber, he has raised a home bright with hope. This is not just a tale of endurance. It is a lesson in the strength of respect, of compassion, and of the new beginnings that family can bring. You might be wondering, what comes next for Ethan and his family? Will the shadows of that outlaw trading post return? Will new trials rise from neighbors who still cast wary eyes at an Apache woman and her child? Or will Ethan turn his focus to building something larger, perhaps fencing the land, planting crops, turning Timber Hollow from a hideaway into a true ranch where Jonas can grow strong? One thing is certain, with their hearts united. They will face whatever lies ahead. If you believe Ethan and his family deserve their peace, give this story a like. And let us know in the comments what you think he should do next. Should he build stronger defenses around the cabin? Or open his land to something greater? A place where his children can grow up with pride. Not fear. Your thoughts matter. And your voice is part of keeping stories like this alive. Because on the frontier, where wind and dust test the spirit of every soul, a home like Ethan Marlowe's is more than shelter. It is a symbol of hope. It is proof that even after heartbreak and loss, a man can rise, a woman can endure, and together they can build something the world cannot tear down. Perhaps in their story, we all glimpse our own that no matter how deep the winter, there can always be spring again.